Okay, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Heather Asiala, and I am the Communications Program Manager for the Pulte Institute for Global Development here at the University of Notre Dame. On behalf of my colleagues at the Pulte Institute and the university, I'm delighted to welcome you to Session 2 of Populorum Progressio, the Catholic economic alternative as an elixir for the Nigerian economic crisis. The purpose of the summit is to bring together economists, theologians, theorists, and Nigerian policymakers to explore how Catholic social teaching can play a role in Nigerian development. As an integral part of Notre Dame's Keough School of Global Affairs, the Pulte Institute addresses global poverty and inequality through policy, practice, and partnership. We are pleased to be hosting this summit in partnership with the Catholic Diocese of Ondo and our friends at the De Nicola Center for Ethics and Culture, which is the leading center for scholarly reflection within the Catholic moral and intellectual tradition here at Notre Dame. If this is your first session with us, welcome. If you are returning, welcome back. We are delighted to have you here for this discussion. Today, we have an expert panel with us to explore the Catholic narrative and the liberal theory of human development. Before we get started, I would like to remind you all that this is a hybrid event, so we do have guests joining us both in person in Nigeria and virtually on Zoom. So please be respectful of your fellow guests by muting yourselves throughout the session. And we do appreciate your patience if any technical issues do arise during the session. We will have a group discussion and Q&A at the end. So for our Zoom attendees, you can leave a comment in the chat box and we will try to address as many questions as time allows. To get us started today, I have the honor of introducing you to Father Valentine Kolidoye, a priest of the Ondo Diocese and an Episcopal vicar in the Diocese of Basel, Switzerland. He studied moral theology at the Alphonsian Academy in Rome and the University of Innsbruck in Austria. Welcome, Father Valentine.
Live in a country where we made wristwatches and we are told time is time. So right on to the point, I'm here on behalf of His Excellency Most Reverend Dr. Jude Ayode Jarugundade, the Bishop of Ondo Diocese, who is unavoidably absent at this session because he's doing what only a bishop could do, and that's ordaining candidates to the diaconate and to the priesthood. The bishop will have loved to honor all of us here this morning, rather this afternoon in Nigeria and somewhere else in the world in the morning by his presence, but he's at this moment at the cathedral ordaining 10 of our candidates to the diaconate. He will be here tomorrow, and he has asked that I inform all those who are participating physically and virtually that he will be at the session tomorrow, and he will personally like to thank all of you and to welcome you to this very important summit. I welcome those who are physically present here in Akure, and to all our panelists who are actually participating by Zoom from different parts of the world, in Nigeria and outside of Nigeria. On behalf of Bishop Jude, you are all welcome, and he thanks you for taking time to come and share with us your wealth of knowledge on this most important topic of human development since the time of the Blessed Pope Paul VI in the Populorum Progressio. I think that is enough 2 minutes, and I'm hanging out. Thank you very much, Ida.
Thank you, Father. We'll pass it over to Father Fidelis to welcome our panelists now.
Well,
of preacher is the vice systematic theology and Thomistic Studies in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at the Dominican University in Nigeria. Father Akinwale studied at the University of the Republic of Congo. Akinwale is a fellow of the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology, DePaul University, Chicago. Is the founder of Patristic Association of Nigeria, a member of Academic Council Studia Gilsoniana, a journal of the International of Etienne Gilson Society, just to mention a few of the reputable councils that he is a member of. Father Akinwale began his teaching career as a teaching assistant at the Boston College in 1993, and has since taught several courses, published many articles in national and international journals on the explorations into the history of Christian doctrine, intellectual coherence, and contemporary relevance of Christian doctrines. And he has a formidable expertise in the writings of the Christian fathers, like Augustine of Hippo, Thomas Aquinas, John Henry Newman, Vess Conger, just to mention a few. But Akinwale speaks, of course, English, Yoruba, and French. He has a reading competence in German, Greek, Hebrew, Latin, Spanish, and Italian. Today, Father Akinwale will be reflecting for 12 minutes on the Catholic narrative of human development through the principle of person and the common good, and he will try to make the connection between the absence of public thinking on the person and the common good and the Nigeria underdevelopment. Father, you're welcome. Speaking after Father Akinwale will be Professor Olalekan Yunusa. Professor Olalekan Yunusa is presently the Honorary Commissioner for Economic Planning and Budget for the State Government of Osun. He's a professor of economics with special interest in microeconomics of international currencies, development finance, social policy designs, among some of his intellectual interests. Professor Yunusa graduated with first-class honors from Obafemi Awolowo University, Ile-Ife. He was a Fulbright visiting scholar at the Department of Economics, Fordham University, New York, my alma mater. Was also a visiting lecturer at the University of Botswana, a professor of economics. Also, he was the professor of economics at Obafemi Awolowo University at Ile-Ife. Professor Yunusa is an experienced professor of economics with demonstrated history of working in the higher education industry. He has several years of experience in public procurement, policy analysis, budget development, and venture capital. He has served as a consultant to many national and international organizations, some of which are the UNICEF, the UNDP, the African Development Bank, the National Bureau of Statistics. And he has also published extensively in many national and international journals. Today, Professor Yunusa will be reflecting for 12 minutes on the translation and the contextualization of human development theory to actionable plans fitting for the Nigerian context. Professor, you're welcome. Next to Professor Yunusa will be Professor Diane Desiato. Professor Diane Desiato is a professor of law and LLM faculty director with a joint appointment at the Keele School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame, Indiana. Professor Desiato teaches, publishes, and practices in the areas of international law and human rights, international economic law and development, comparative public law. She's a member of the expert group of the United Nations Working Group on the Right to Development, also active as International Counsel at matters successfully litigated at the Permanent Court of Arbitration and the United Nations Human Rights Committee. She was appointed by the Philippine Supreme Court as Professor of International Law and Human Rights at the Philippines Judicial Academy. She serves on the board of so many journals, some of which are the board of the European Journal of International Law, Journal of the World Investment and Trade, International Law Studies, and many others. She has taught at the University of Philippines, Peking University School of Transnational Law, China, University of Hawaii, Richardson School of Law. She holds DSD and LLM degrees from Yale Law School in the United States, as well as JD and BSc Economics with summa cum laude from the University of the Philippines. Today, Professor Desiato, for 12 minutes, will be reflecting on subsistence right and the Nigeria's continued obligation under the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Professor, you are welcome. I will now yield the ground to Professor Akinwale Anthony.
Thank you very much, Father Fidelis. And it's my delight to be part of this program. Thank you for inviting me. There are two presuppositions of my intervention. First, to be presupposed are the four pillars of Catholic social teaching, namely human dignity, the common good, subsidiarity, and solidarity. The second presupposition is the central idea of the encyclical Populorum Progressio of Pope Paul VI, that is, development is centered on the human person. It is in fact the case that to read Populorum Progressio is to read a commentary on Africa. I shall begin by briefly recalling these four principles. At the heart of Catholic social teaching is a strong affirmation of the dignity of the human person, from the womb to the tomb. The political process would be unjust if it fails to protect and promote the dignity of the human person. It is a question of sacred reverence for the dignity of conscience, freedom of choice, freedom to fulfill one's legitimate aspirations, and freedom to actualize one's God-given potential. Where this dignity is violated or abbreviated, where countries have abysmally low standard of respect for human dignity, there cannot be authentic development. What is at stake in the task of development is not just the provision of infrastructure and posting of good economic indices, but fundamentally recognition, respect, and promotion of human dignity as a transcendent value gifted to us by the Creator. The second principle is the common good. Human dignity cannot be promoted outside an intelligently regulated common life, that is, outside a political process that is vaccinated from the whims and caprices of politicians. That is why Catholic social teaching also espouses respect and work for the common good, that is, fulfillment of the human person in our collective fulfillment, the actualization of potentials of each person in the actualization of our collective potential. The common good is the sum total of social conditions which allow people, either as groups or as individuals, to reach their fulfillment more fully and more easily. And the third principle is solidarity, that is, a firm and persevering determination to commit oneself to the common good, that is to say, to the good of all and of each individual, because we are all really responsible for all. But solidarity goes together with subsidiarity. That is the fourth principle. Subsidiarity is the principle which states that a community of a higher order should not interfere in the internal life of a community of a lower order, depriving the latter of its functions, but rather should support it in case of need, and help to coordinate its activity with the activities of the rest of society, always with a view to the common good. I would add that the principle of subsidiarity is consistent with a theology of grace, according to which grace does not suppress but sublates nature. It is a principle that applies to the Nigerian situation in a special way. It provides a critique to Nigeria's pretension to being regulated by a federal constitution. Applied to Nigeria, the state should not disable the citizen and then turn around to take over functions that citizens can perform. The federal government should not deprive state governments of their ability to perform functions they can perform. And state governments should not undermine local governments. The principle of subsidiarity sublates the principle of federalism. It should guide the relationship between the different tiers of government in Nigeria, federal, state, and local, as well as relationship between the government and the citizen. It is often assumed that Nigeria's problems are corruption, insecurity, and poverty. Those who assume that the problem is corruption refer to a history of how proceeds from the oil wealth have ended up in wrong hands and in wrong pockets. No one would deny that Nigeria's wealth has ended in the hands of the people. No one would deny that Nigeria's wealth has not ended in the hands of the people. As the narrative continues, one hears of how corruption impoverishes the people and how poverty leads to insecurity. Again, no one familiar with Nigeria would deny that she is currently afflicted by poverty and insecurity. I contend, however, that corruption, insecurity, and poverty are symptoms and not the cause of Nigeria's ailment. The genesis of corruption, insecurity, poverty, and underdevelopment in Nigeria is a constitutional arrangement that ignores the four principles I have just outlined. Surely the problems we're dealing with antedate the current constitution, a constitution which came into effect in 1999. However, the current constitutional arrangement reflects the command and control military mentality that characterized the Nigerian state during the two bouts of military rule Nigeria experienced, first from 1966 to 1970, and then from 1983 to 1999. Prior to military rule, Nigeria was no paradise. However, a headache prior to military rule became a brain tumor with the advent of military rule. Prior to military rule, Nigeria did not have a perfect constitutional arrangement. No country has. Nonetheless, she had a constitution which, despite its defects, bore the potential of managing her ethnic and religious diversity. With military rule came a centralized command and control state. It was possible, and indeed it happened, that the region that commanded and controlled the military, controlled state apparatus at the center, and the government at the center appropriated the wealth of the land, thus impoverishing the people and generating underdevelopment. In 1979, at the end of the first bout of military rule, and in 1999, at the end of the second bout of military rule, a constitution was imposed on Nigeria by the military. The 1979 constitution and its identical twin, the 1999 constitution, equate to Nigeria a government that replicates the centralized command and control military arrangement. Three provisions of the constitution would suffice to buttress my assertion, and that is, apart from the fact that the two constitutions were imposed by military decrees. The first can be found in Section 2 of the 1999 Constitution, which repeats word for word Section 2 of the 1979 Constitution. According to this section, and I quote, Nigeria is one indivisible and indissoluble sovereign state. This constitutional provision, end of quote, this constitutional provision places the state above the citizen, setting Nigeria up as a land where the state is more powerful than the citizen. Where the state is more powerful than the human person, human dignity is violated. The human person is disabled as his or her capacity to actualize her potential is in the hands of the state. An underdeveloped polity is one whose citizens are unable to develop themselves because their capacity to improve the quality of their life is severely eroded, in this instance, by the Constitution. We are reminded here of the central insight of Populorum Progressio, that development is not merely about economic indices and technical infrastructure, but fundamentally centered on the human person. Where human dignity is violated, the principle of solidarity is equally violated. It is therefore my first submission that Section 2 of the Nigerian Constitution is inimical to development in the proper sense of the word. Now, that section supports the Land Use Decree of 1978, which practically dispossessed the people of their land. And when people are dispossessed of their land, they are impoverished. Not only that, the Constitution, by virtue of its exclusive legislative list, places all mineral resources under the control of the federal government. Again, this impoverishes the people. So we have a situation where proceeds from Nigeria's oil sales are used to maintain a big but inefficient and corrupt state. It is, for example, absurd that the oil-producing Niger Delta is a land of rivers without bridges, while Nigeria's federal capital city of Abuja is a land of bridges without rivers. The people living in the region that produces Nigeria's oil wealth live in abject poverty, while state functionaries and all who have access to power and to the corridors of power are enriched by the oil wealth. It is therefore my submission that the inclusion of mineral resources on the exclusive legislative list, as well as the Land Use Decree sustained by Section 2 of the 1979 and 1999 Constitution, it is my submission that this impoverishes the people while permitting government functionaries to live on the wealth of the people. Such is antithetical to development. My conclusion, the Nigerian Constitution violates human dignity by making the state to be more powerful than the citizen, which is a characteristic of dictatorship. By violating human dignity, it violates the principle of solidarity. By disabling the citizen, it violates the principle of subsidiarity. And by violating human dignity, the principle of solidarity, and the principle of subsidiarity, it is antithetical to the common good. In a nutshell, Nigeria's constitutional arrangement abysmally fails the test of 4 principles of Catholic social doctrine, undermines the developmental capacity of the people, and thus facilitates corruption, insecurity, and poverty. Corruption, insecurity, and poverty, though they are developmental challenges, are not causes, but symptoms of Nigeria's problems. The real problem is the Constitution. Thank you. I hope I have not exceeded my time.
Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you for your talk. I will now yield the ground to Professor Yunusa. Take it up from there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everybody. I'm particularly delighted to join this meeting and to be part of this discussion, dialogue. And I want to start by first agreeing with the first presenter about the constitutional issues, which everybody in Nigeria have been speaking to in the past few years now, or decades, as it were. The whole arrangement is lopsided because just as an illustration, I cannot understand even as structured where a federal government that does not have any land, we have a Ministry of Lands and Rural Development. I mean, Ministry of Agriculture. Where are they going to cultivate anything that they want to cultivate? Is absurd and is wrong. Essentially, again, quite a lot of things are put under the exclusive list of the federal government, at the expense of the subnational government. This is also not right and is anti-development. People have been talking about restructuring, and I think this particular debate and discussion will contribute, to that, that debate. However, I think the fundamental question that is raised, as the theme of this particular summit, essentially borders on how do we create a developmental state instead of a predatory state. All the picture that has been painted by the last speaker essentially speaks to the issue around predatory states, that is where power and state machinery for perpetuating private benefits of leaders, his family and friends, is entrenched in a particular community. Any system where you have that, you begin to see a lot of issues emanating. And that is what the Constitution laid very strong foundation for. And I think fundamentally, the Constitution is the first thing to be looked at if we are going to be able to create, a developmental state, which is a system whereby policies and institutions for value creation and competitiveness for all the people and for all firms. Essentially, we are speaking to a situation whereby all the citizens of the country are able to benefit from the resources of the country. They are able to contribute their own quotas in terms of value creation and value propositions, to the development of that particular state. So the fundamental issue and the question that I want to address there is how do we actually promote developmental states instead of, predatory states, in a particular economy. And please, let's move on to the next slide. The next one. Move on to the next one. But I think fundamentally, the original issue that is often raised in economics, no, please go back, that is often raised in economics, it has to do with, what are the various factors that actually determine growth. Because if we are talking about how resources are shared, please, the previous slide, if we are talking about how resources are shared, essentially the wealth, the output of the economy must be built in such a way that, we have something to be shared. So, and if we are talking about developmental states, we are saying that is a combination of both political and the economic component. That's the economic component, that's the political component. And it is the use of these two forces that brings about an output which is to be shared. So when you talk about why are some countries rich and some are poor, we can be raising the issue around differences in capital accumulation and technical change, the issue of economic institutions, institutions of production, and institutions of exchange. When you talk about institutions of production and institutions of exchange, how are all these harmonized for optimal production of value in a particular economy? And the third one could speak to the issue around the various economic systems that have existed up to today. And if you look at these various economic systems, it borders on the issue of socialism or traces of it. You talk about, some of the Catholic principles that was enunciated by the professor actually spoke to this issue of solidarity, subsidiarity, and indeed, common goods, in which case we are able to bring resources together and get accumulated from the various producers of all these assets, pull it together and distribute in such a way that there are no outliers. Even if there are going to be outliers, that is people who live excessive life, we are able to moderate, the average life of every individual. And at the end of the day, we're able to have, the dignity of human existence, upgraded, as it were. But, there has been a lot of debate as to whether socialism is the best way or, liberalism is the best way. But the truth of the matter is that up to today, with all the reservations about neoliberalism, capitalism, as it were, is still the dominant, political, the global economic framework that is used for the coordination of the resources of the economy, where, we have in a place, an open world where that is governed by market forces of demand and supply and is regulated by a lot of international financial institutions. But the truth of the matter is that even if the economy has grown, how do we ensure that we are able to guarantee human development and we are able to reduce poverty among the people? And that is the point that I will dwell more on as I move on. Next slide, please. So the emerging international consensus around this, has to do with how do we now ensure sustainable human development by harnessing all the resources, that are available to everybody, to the global world, in such a way that everybody is able to have choices, which is something that is very important that has been raised. In this case, human development refers to process of enlarging human choices and their capabilities. Okay, so the effectiveness or otherwise of these depends on the institutional structure prevailing in a particular economy. And I must say that the kind of institutions that exist in a particular economy are not particularly very, very the same. So each country must evolve a strategy or an institution that will be able to guarantee improved welfare for everybody. And just to look at some common features, some features between systems that guarantees human development and that of neoliberalism. On the next slide, please. You will see that, under the human development theory, which, essentially dwell on all these principles as raised by the Reverend Father that spoke, the professor, the human development emphasizes the role of the state as the hub for coordinating the activities of all human beings in the system. While on the other hand, the neoliberalism, talks about, minimal states, in which case states should play only regulatory role, and it should be very, very minimal to avoid a situation whereby you now build a very super state that undermines or submerges the role that individuals are supposed to play under his own, his own operations. Then for the human development, talks about it has to be democratic and inclusive. And that is what is missing under neoliberalism, just democratic, by even the choice of leaders in that particular process is democratic. However, under human development, people must be involved in the process of everything that will be done. The focus of human development is the people. While the guiding principle under the neoliberalism is economic efficiency. The emphasis of the human development is on hands, while this of neoliberalism talks more of the means to that particular hand. And I must say that while the key assumption of human development talks about growth must be consciously made pro-poor and pro-poor, pro-people at the end of the day. But under neoliberalism talks about the trickle-down effects, which essentially may not happen. And next slide, please. So how could liberal doctrines translate it to human development? How can this happen? The first thing is that, with the rule of the game, starting from the configuration of the constitution must be changed in such a way that it empowers and, the subnationals and the local government level, whereby they are able to play to the fullest of their potentials. Again, planning must be seen as a means to an end and not necessarily planning seen as an end in itself. In the previous years, over the years in the 60s and right from the late 1930s of the Great Depression, what has been preached is a situation whereby you have extensive, planning, a form of central planning system that does not promote or try to undermine the creativity and innovation of the private sector. And that has not been very, very helpful in terms of growing the wealth of nations. And as a result of that, we are advocating that going forward, planning should be seen as a means to an end and not necessarily an end in itself, in which case we should use planning as a tool for altering the institutions of production in such a way that we do not we do not produce at the subsistence level, but we produce at a level whereby we could have an increasing return to scale. Then the other one is extensive public sector reforms, that will put the people first is important. There is no way an economy can grow and develop without the people. And what this means is that there must be a very, very extensive public sector reforms, in which case all the institutions of government must be reformed, but those institutions will not be reformed appropriately if there is no capacity building for the people. And that is what we have been missing. In the past, the best of people should be in the public sector to design and implement policies. But where those are missing, and only very few people that may not actually be the best in the society are the people there, then there is a challenge. The idea that people, most people don't want to join politics should also be discouraged. That is what Awolowo said. What good people suffer for not taking part in politics is to be ruled by fools. And if we don't want to be ruled by fools, let everybody be there. And we can produce leaders that are very, very educated and literate, not just going to school, but are literate people who understand the essence of policy and the people that are going to, the people that are formulating policies for. And all the way down, there must be extensive and regular engagement with the people in every form, in every place, even the form of policy development and implementation. People must be there. And, all the nations of the world must also know, developing, and those that are even underdeveloped must know that there is need for collaboration. And this collaboration is the one that must understand that development is not a zero-sum game. It's not a situation whereby if some countries are now getting out of poverty, those ones that are already out of poverty several centuries ago feel threatened that they could be, they could be slowed down. That will not happen. And I think, some of the reforms that should take place in the public sector, the first thing is we need to define a new pragmatic and result-oriented framework Number two is the clarification of objectives and administrative structures, that guarantees that results, are achieved. Designing goal-oriented competencies and skills development is also very, very fundamental. Then professionalization and improved morale. There is need for professionalization of even the service in the public sector. These are the people who should have the institutional memory of what is going on in the system and be able to conduct government businesses in a way that will dignify the people. But just like Father said, which is entrenched in the Constitution, is the fact that governance and public sector reforms in Nigeria, please move to the next slide. Has been limited by weak integration of the subnational governments in the design and implementation. And it is as a result of the structure of the country, which is embedded in the Constitution. And we are saying that this should also change. I'm going to talk now on some of the reforms that are taking place at the subnational level, the state of Osun, and how we think that this could be, a model to look at, and how it has actually translated into getting results at the subnational level. Number one is the fact that I spoke about a leader that is literate, and that is fundamental one. And for us in the state of Osun, my governor, even before he came into office, declared that he's going to run an inclusive and participatory government, meaning that at every stage of the design, implementation, and even the monitoring of various projects and programs, he is going to consult with the people and get people to be part of the process, as it were. And again, efficient management of public resources and service delivery is also very key. And that has to be done in a transparent way and adequate priority given to the needs of the people. Immediately he got into office, what we did was to conduct, he went around the entire state, and the first thing he did was to do thank you tour. And in the process of doing this, he demanded from the people, what exactly are the things that you want from the new government that was to be formed? And, people came up with everything that that is required, that they believe will be able to enhance their productivity in their various areas. And again, after that, we also conducted what we call, citizens' needs assessment with the support of UK DFID, the Partnership for Reform Learning, Partnership for Reform Learning and Learning, to actually work with us in this particular process. And we collated all this, and all these were put together as a very fundamental resource, which is going to be used for our purpose in that particular process. But I must add that in the process of doing this, we have also re-engineered the institutions of government to be able to have the carrying capacity for some of the things that we will be doing. The architecture for planning the state was restructured, and appropriate structures of engagement were also created in this particular process. The planning department, the monitoring and evaluation, development cooperation, etc. And the professionalization of cadres was also embarked upon, for that particular process. And I must say that it was after all those were done that we started the planning process. And in that planning, we were able to review all the various policies of governments and existing rules and laws that we feel are going to be, stopping or hindering progress in the states. And after that, an envisioning workshop was actually convened, which essentially brought together all various categories of people, different clusters of people from, the highest, the most elitist people in the society,
Professor,
up to even the. Sorry?
Professor, can you hear me?
No, I'm hearing you now.
Okay.
I'm hearing you now.
Okay. We're 12 minutes, about 40 minutes gone. Can you bring your points to
summarize? Okay, I will summarize now. So we have all those, structures created, and we realize that the outcomes that we have been getting is a situation whereby we have a policy-based budgeting. the results, predictability and control in budget execution, and more importantly, all our systems are now subjected to public scrutiny, because all things that we do, the budget and its execution, were placed online and people can engage us. We have the citizens group also working with us extensively. But what are the drivers, for this? We realize that visionary leadership is important. Homegrown initiatives that fit into the local context is appropriate. Forging a result-based spirit is also very, very critical. People's willingness to develop. Institutional development, both institutions of government and institutions of markets, are improved upon, and platform for effective policy coordination and engagement with citizens and development partners were also created. What are the key conclusions? I want to say that it is possible to put human development at the center of governance by actually deliberately altering both the economic structure of production and institution of exchange for effective service delivery and improve welfare for our people in time and space. Strong political will, homegrown strategies consistent with the local content, inclusive and participatory governance strategy, and collaboration, effective collaboration with citizens, stakeholders, and development partners are key. With God on our side, I believe this is what has been helping us at the subnational level to get to where we are. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor, for your time. Thank you. I will yield the ground now to Professor Deanne Desiato.
Thank you, Father Fidelis, and thank you, Professors Akinwale and Professor Yunusa. My thanks to the Pulte Institute, the De Nicola Center, as well as the Catholic Diocese of Ondo. It is a particularly distinct privilege on my end to be able to address colleagues in Nigeria. Two of my closest friends in international law and human rights are prominent Nigerian international lawyers, and one of whom is a professor at the University of Oxford who I work with, Dapo Akande, who teaches international law and human rights. My task today for 12 minutes actually follows from what Professor Akinwale and Professor Yunusa discussed relative to the nature of reforms at the constitutional structural level and the developmental planning public sector policy reforms that Professor Yunusa was discussing. There is an overarching framework by which we can look at development outside of the neoliberal version or vision that Professor Yunusa contrasted earlier. When we talk about the right to development, I draw from the definition in the 1986 Declaration on the Right to Development at the United Nations General Assembly, to which Nigeria was also a party. That definition looks at development as a right that is enjoyed by individuals, groups, and populations to enjoy, participate, and contribute to their own civil, political, economic, social, and cultural development. In the latest pending draft of the UN Convention on the Right to Development, that is still under consideration at the United Nations, where I serve as an expert at the working group, and where Nigeria is also active at the open-ended working group on the right to development. A specific qualifier was placed in the draft convention to the definition of the right to development in 1986. That qualifier says that the participation, contribution, and enjoyment of the right to development, to economic, social, cultural, political, and civil development should be one that is based on and consistent with all human rights and fundamental freedoms. The reason why this in particular is the innovation and was largely responsible for drafting this definition is that at this point in time in 2021, we can no longer conceptualize of development separately from the standards of enjoyment of human rights in their civil, political, economic, social, and cultural senses. When Father Fidelis and I co-authored a policy brief looking at subsistence rights, which are moral rights, vis-a-vis Nigeria's continuing binding legal obligations under the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the obligations of Nigeria are quite clear under that covenant. It shouldn't be controversial to think that there should be every attempt on the part of the Nigerian government to undertake steps to the maximum of its available resources using all appropriate means to ensure the realization of covenant rights. That includes, among those covenant rights, that includes the right to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health, the right to education, the right to just and favorable conditions of work, the right to social security, the right to an adequate standard of living. So the very same service delivery issues that Professor Yunusa was pointing out earlier are actually not matters of political realization alone, but are actually of binding legal obligation of Nigeria towards its own citizens. The paradox right now, especially in 2021, is that Nigeria, as we all know, is a country of vast natural resources and energy reserves. It is Africa's largest oil producer, and it is one of the most powerful members of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. The running expression in international economic law is when Nigeria sneezes, oil prices around the world fall. But the question is, given this natural resource endowment, given its power and heft in the international system, why then does poverty and inequality remain so rampant within Nigeria, to the point that in Nigeria's own 2019 Poverty and Inequality Report, there's an emphasis that 40% of the total population of Nigeria, which has since been updated to about close to 105 million people, live below the country's poverty line. And even in the United Nations' own global multidimensional poverty index, which is based on looking at how Nigerians enjoy their health, education, and living standards, the report is alarming and persistent. Nigeria, close to 20% of Nigeria's population is vulnerable on health, education, and living standards. Close to 30% is experiencing severe poverty, where they are deprived of about 50% to 100% of the needed health, education, and living standards. When in sum, this means about 93 million persons to this day, about 105 million persons, whose health, education, living standards, which include housing, food, water, sanitation, energy, electricity needs, are in grave peril for Nigeria today. By any measure, this is a crisis for economic, social, and cultural rights that are held by Nigerians, their own subsistence rights, and arguably their fundamental basic human right to life. It's just both a civil and a political right. This continued imperiling of human life in Nigeria, as Father Fidelis and I have discussed in our policy brief, is also rooted in a moral pathology that has tolerated governance and social systems that for so long has remained unresponsive and unaccountable to the most vulnerable in Nigeria. To this end, therefore, we do argue that the success of any rights-based approach to human development in Nigeria, one that does not only look at poverty and inequality as empirical artifacts, but one that is rooted in the understanding of the flourishing of the human person. This depends so heavily on engaging our local parish communities in Nigeria to address not just the immoralities of corruption, but the persistence of systemic unaccountability and the lack of participation of communities in defining their own development, in participating in and contributing to their own development, which is central to the right to development, as I discussed earlier. I come from the Philippines, where there are many similarities, as I often discuss with my friends in Nigeria. I come from the Philippines that has many natural disasters, but we don't have the same volume of natural resources and international presence that Nigeria has and influence that Nigeria has. And yet, even growing up and witnessing how the basic deprivation of services, which are essential to living standards, which are essential to intergenerational growth and development, especially for the most vulnerable elements of our population, women, children, the disabled, the elderly, indigenous peoples, among others. I witnessed early on that the kind of poverty and the kind of inequality that was rampant, still rampant in my home country, is precisely a product of also what Father Fidelis describes in his own work as a maladjustment and enforced incapability. There are moral and legal dimensions to human rights to life and subsistence. And when that maladjustment or enforced incapability is not addressed, we're looking at the situation where being poor is no longer just about being low income, but it entails throughout one's lifespan the deprivation of all the social goods that are necessary for one's life and human flourishing, whether that be education, health, consistent access to water, to energy, to electricity needs, the full plethora of opportunities that are readily available in the developed world, but for some reason, and for many structural reasons that Professor Akinwale and Professor Yunusa rightly pointed out, have not been addressed when it comes to Nigeria. Nigeria has been a party to the International Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights since 1993. And yet it has never reported to the United Nations consistent with its own basic obligations under Articles 16 and 17 of this treaty. It has never submitted its own required reporting on the status of its own implementation of the rights to education, health, social security, just and favorable conditions of work, cultural participation, among others. This is already a fundamental baseline problem, because where there is no information forthcoming in the international system, where there is no transparency, the opportunities for participation are narrow, the possible involvement and activity and leadership that can come from our grassroots communities is also scarce. And you find that there is a concentration of power within very particular elites that does not lend itself well to a democratic conception, or certainly a liberal conception of human development. Now, of course, as have been rightly pointed out by my colleagues and co-panelists, there have been many causes and factors that have been identified for the protracted ubiquity of extreme poverty and inequality within Nigeria, which accounts for basically almost all of sub-Saharan Africa. Among these are the systemic corruption pointed out, the non-diversification of the economy, income inequality, the concentration of power, of wealth and decision-making within a very few elites, which is why Professor Akinwale's discussion of the need for solidarity and structural reforms to the Constitution are so important. There's also many possible drivers and factors of shocks to multidimensional poverty. In our view, and I'm speaking for myself as well as for Father Fidelis in the course of his own work at the Pulte Institute, all of these collective causes and factors persist because they are crucially anchored on the nature of moral choices that are made in the process of governmental decision-making, even in things like budgetary allocations. When there is a long history of top-down, non-participatory, non-transparent economic decision-making within Nigeria's public and possibly private sectors, such as how the oil revenue funds are distributed or allocated, there is ultimately a lack of institutional or individual accountability for the continuing failure to ensure respect, protection, and fulfillment of the full spectrum of Nigerians' civil, political, economic, social, cultural, and developmental rights. The fact that in 2021, 105 million Nigerians' fundamental subsistence rights continue to be imperiled with no accountability domestically or internationally should give us all reason to pause. And so for this reason, the policy recommendations on our end actually might seem rather controversial, because lawyers would usually prescribe litigation. I actually don't think that's the way to go. What we need here is to engage at the outset more of Nigeria's local communities to promote awareness and understanding of their fundamental economic, social, cultural rights, and most importantly, to tap the parish networks, such as the Catholic Diocese of Ondo, in ensuring that there is that collective groundswell of understanding, discussion, participation, contribution, and enjoyment of the right to development, by itself facilitating defining a shared agenda, promoting continued dialogue and meaningful consultation, as well as fostering cohesive trust, openness, and active participation and initiative from Nigeria's local communities themselves. It is not for me or for any other external party to prescribe what development means for the Nigerian population. For us in the Philippines, it means different things. It doesn't necessarily entail all of the attributes of consumerism and neoliberalism that many in the Western world associate development with. But it does entail meeting our basic living standards, our subsistence standards, that is the baseline of what is prescribed under the Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights. So some of the issues that we suggest could be considered, there are 5 of them. One is, as was pointed out rightly by Professor Akinwale, who is himself the expert here, an examination of Nigeria's constitution and how we could build in more participatory mechanisms for realizing and protecting the subsistence rights of Nigerian populations, especially the 105 million who are vulnerable in extreme poverty. Second, looking at the justiciability or of possible justiciability of socioeconomic rights for redress within courts or regulatory agencies when there is a right to a remedy for governmental failures to protect, respect, facilitate, or otherwise fulfill economic, social, and cultural rights. South Africa is the famous model of justiciability of economic, social, cultural rights, where individuals in South Africa can directly petition the courts to ensure that governments do their job to provide basic living standards, including access to water, including access to health facilities and housing. And lastly, yes, Father Fidelis, I'm wrapping up right now. Thank you. Lastly, there's an examination of accountability for the distribution of oil revenues, monitoring and evaluation mechanisms on the implementation of Nigeria's subsistence rights, and as we said earlier, forums such as these, which are important for public awareness promotion, education, and transparency. Thank you very much, and I look forward to everyone's questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Desato. Before questions, we have some interventions, and I guess some of them are here. And after the interventions, we turn over to the questions. And if you have a question directed to a particular panelist, you can let us know. If the question is not well directed to the right panelist, I have the permission to reframe the question and redirect it to the right panelist. But before then, if Pastor Professor Abdul Ganiyu Ajani Garba from Bowen University, Iwo, is here, he can have the ground now for his intervention. You have 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Father Fidelis. It's been a very useful time listening to Father Akinwale, Professor Yunusa, and Professor Desato. And I think all of them raise very important issues that addresses different dimensions of the problem. And I think starting with Father Akinwale, I think the issue of clearly distinguishing symptoms from problem is very, very critical to this conversation. And I also think that the dimensions of the problem have also been emphasized. At least 2 dimensions of the problem have been touched by the 3 speakers. The dimensions of the history, which I look at in terms of the length of the problem. So there's this historical process that has led us to the kind of major problems with the Constitution and also problems with the symptoms that we are observing. I think Professor Yunusa has also emphasized another dimension of the problem, which is the breadth of the problem in terms of the nexus between the citizens and the state, and also the units of the state level, the local level, and the federal level. But I think one of the points that is being missed, which I think the conversation can improve upon, is the global dimension, the global nexus. We don't have enough time within the 4 minutes to actually articulate the position that we hold in terms of the impossibility of a neoliberal or even the human development paradigms leading to a developmental state in most of the countries of the world. If we look at the historical dimension and the breadth dimensions, there are issues there that we can actually highlight on to make it impossible for the hope to become a reality. And that is why the promises of development that started from the 60s with the various UN interventions is actually unable to deliver beyond just conversations and discussions. The third dimension that I think is very important, which in progressing further, we may need to emphasize on, is actually the depth of the discussion. And the depth of the analysis is the spiritual dimension, because the Bible makes it very clear. And I think as Christians, we should not be ashamed of emphasizing our convictions, because even the Catholic social teaching is based on the Bible. I think we have no apologies to emphasize that there's a spiritual dimension to this problem. Because as the Bible teaches us, if the foundations be destroyed, what shall the righteous do? In concluding, Professor Yunusa said, in other words, we're hoping that if God is on one side. But the problem is that God cannot be on the side of anyone that does not do his will. And as I said, because of time dimension, we will not be able to discover, we can have the conversation one-on-one. If we look at the history of economic thought, from the scholastic era to the mercantilist era, the spiritual dimension was destroyed at that point. Because even the understanding of humanity and even the whole 4 element principles of Catholic social teaching were destroyed at that level. So to expect that a system of thought, a system of meaning, and a system of practice that is totally at variance with the foundations and the requirements for delivering on the Catholic social teaching will actually produce the same Catholic social teaching is an expectation is an impossibility. And I think we need to understand that. And that is why I think that the future of this conversation, we need to bring in fully the 3 dimensions, the historical dimensions, the breadth dimension, and also the depth dimension in a way that is organic and systematic. And I think if we do that, many of the hopes that we have, because we end on the notion of hope. But the problem is that, what is the basis of that hope? If the foundation for actualizing that hope is actually destroyed. And I think that is a challenge that we need to face. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Kaba. Dr. Omolola Olarinde, I wouldn't know if she's here today, but she sent me an email this morning about a little bit of indisposition. If Dr. Eric Olabode Olapis is here from Elizabeth University, we'll have your ground. Is Dr. Eric here today? Then we'll move to the Reverend Canon Dr. Benedict Koledoye and Dr. Kinsey for their intervention.
Thank you very much. The panelists, all of them, they spoke so eloquently about the institutional framework as the main problem of the underdevelopment in Nigeria. And Father Kewale rightly mentioned that the review of the Constitution is very, very important, which I agree with. And Professor Yunusa also made that very good assertion. However, Professor Yunusa also spoke about the policy reforms, etc., etc. And why are the policies not working? That is actually the question that I think is very important in this discussion. Development programs or theories, they are not inherently positive or negative. I believe it depends on the context of its implementation. And so the context of Nigeria must be put in focus when we discuss development. And what is the context of Nigeria? Is fundamentally a rent economy. And that perhaps answers the question of Professor Desiato. And when we talk about this, the rent economy, there are some things that are associated with rent economy. It is not rocket science. So the questions and the critical debates associated with rentier economy are, first, the extent to which rent economy makes government less democratic. And the second one is the extent to which rent economy causes government to do a poorer job of promoting economic development. And the third one is the impact of rentier economy on citizens, rentier behavior or rentier mentality. And that is always grabbing. It's unfortunate that when we talk about Nigeria economy or what really thrives in Nigeria economy, we agree, probably we all will agree that the oxygen of Nigeria economy is corruption. And why? So the 8 areas which rent economy contributes to the fragility and development issues in Nigeria, if I may quickly say them, is a struggle over ownership and control of specific natural resources or extractive spaces by various stakeholders, the state inclusive, and groups within a state, often compounded by external intervention of support for one of the conflict parties, and the struggle over distribution and use of public revenues derived from natural resources by various local stakeholders and groups, and inability of weak state institutions to cope with large rents from natural resources, coupled with the issue of corruption, misappropriation, exclusion of the society, leading to violent protest and resistance. And fourth is the issue of the use of official and unofficial revenues from natural resources by the state and its governing elites to build up finance, strong and repressive security machinery as a means to keep hegemonic elites against opposition from counter-hegemonic forces, and use of legal and illegal rent from natural resources by splinter groups, disgruntled factions of governing elites and opposition forces to sponsor anti-government insurgencies, secession movements, and insurrection. And that is the reality of Nigeria today. So we're not just talking about the institutional framework. I think what is important is also the normative aspect of development. So I yield the ground now for Barrister Dr. Hilary. Thank you.
Please, I want to correct myself before Barrister Dr. Hilary makes his commentaries. He's not Dr. Kingsley, his younger brother is Dr. Kingsley. It's Kingsley, sorry. He's Dr. Barrister Hilary Okwagbole, sorry.
Thank you very much, Father, for that correction. I'd like to present my perspectives from the legal background, because I'm a lawyer, and of course, my leaning is law. Dr. Desiato made reference to the Nigerian obligation with regards to international obligations. And I'd like to address that point. The concept of development is so fundamental that it cannot escape from the contraption of constitution. The Nigerian constitution is the bedrock of the Nigerian environment. And of course, it is the reason Nigeria is operating a rent economy. Specifically, the question of development has been articulated in international space in different ways. And so that's why we have concepts like the Millennium Development Goals, now the Sustainable Development Goals. We also have, like Dr. Desiato, Professor Desiato said, the United Nations Declaration on the Right to Development. All of these instruments chorus the same thing, which is that development cannot escape, cannot be divorced from the human person. And I think Professor Akinwale also made that point, that you cannot have human development, or rather you cannot have development without talking about the human person. So the Nigerian constitution brings us to a point where we are in a dilemma. The federal government has all the powers, but does not have the resources or the time to exercise all the powers. And so you have something like Section 44 of the Constitution, which provides that mineral resources wherever found in Nigeria belongs to the federal government. So if you found gold in Osun, it belongs to the federal government. State government can't do anything about it. If you found oil anywhere in the world, anywhere in Nigeria, it belongs to the federal government. The states or local governments cannot do anything about it. And so we create a situation whereby powers are arrogated to institutions that do not have the time and energy to exercise those powers. And so we bring ourselves to a point where development eludes us. Concerning the Nigerian obligation to international instruments, Section 12 of the Constitution is the suspect. It says that unless international instruments are domesticated, they cannot have the force of law. So Nigeria has ratified, for instance, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Development, but that will make no meaning unless and until the National Assembly enacts those obligations into law. And so we have an example. The African Charter on Human and People's Rights was concluded in 1981, came into force in 1986, and then the Nigerian Parliament, as the National Assembly, enacted into law before it even came into force in 1983. And so that formed the basis for the ECOWAS Court of Justice to declare that the federal government has an obligation to ensure that Nigerians have right to quality education, even though Nigeria argued against that point. And so when SERAP, a non-governmental organization, brought Nigeria to the ECOWAS Court of Justice, the federal government argued against their position, saying that the right to education was not an obligation for the federal government because it is contained in Chapter 2 of the Constitution. What that means is that Chapter 2 of the Constitution is another problem. And it's important to point out the content of Chapter 2. Chapter 2 of the Constitution provides, for instance, that every Nigerian has a right to adequate health care, that you have a right to education, that you have a right to adequate means of livelihood and standard of living. The problem is that Section 6 of the Constitution now says that you cannot enforce those rights. So even though the Constitution says you have rights, the same Constitution says you can't enforce those rights. And so that was what happened in Archbishop Olubunmi Okoje against Attorney General of Lagos. That question came before the court, whether right to education was enforceable, and the court so declared that the right to education was not enforceable.
Barrister,
yes.
Can you round up?
Okay, yes, sure. And so the right to development, I'd like to reiterate, is caught up by the constitutional problems, which has a parochial definition of human rights. And that is inconsistent with the Vienna Declaration and Program of Action, which was adopted in 1994, which says that human rights are indivisible, interrelated, and inalienable. Unfortunately, the Nigerian Constitution sees human rights as divisible, alienable, and unenforceable in some respects. So I think the way forward is to review the Nigerian Constitution. And I think we need international cooperation to do that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. There's a lot to be harvested. There's a lot to mine. And I'm sure there are so many questions, even though we don't have so much time. So I would reserve my questions and open it to the floor if there are questions. Name the panelists for your question, and we will first gather the first 3 questions and allow the panelists to respond. Please just frame your question. If it's a question, frame it within 40 seconds. If it's a commentary, frame it within 5 seconds. That should be good for a commentary. All right, we can extend the microphone to the gentleman raising his hand with the earpiece. Thank you. Just move according to our head. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I'm most honored to be here today, and I'm also thankful to the speakers, from Father Anthony to Professor Yunusa, Professor Saito, and the observation. I have, as a layman, as a lay faithful, a commoner of this country, I have also decided to pick my point. And my point is, amidst the battle between the law, the policy, and what is actually obtainable with respect to human development and the state of affairs of the country today, the economic system we practice, is there a way? This question is for all the panelists. Anyone can answer. Is there a way I, as a person, can ensure and enforce human person development? Is there a way from, okay, the top to bottom route is no more working. It's not going to work, except we do the constitutional review as suggested by the law. But then, can we try the bottom-up approach? Is there a way the citizens can step in and do something? I need that answer because I think it's very important for me. Because right now, I'm confused. Thank you.
Thank you. I have hands. That is Dr. Pledoy, right? So the hands behind.
Thank you, Chair. Panelists, I'm Dr. Pledoy. I am here also to represent the NMA, Nigerian Medical Association. I have a comment and also some questions. Let me give a bit of background. You know, the last speaker said it's a bit confused. And I must also say somehow, when I listen to discourse like this, I'm a bit confused too. Because the question is, where do we go from here? And, you know, the background I have, of course, I have a background of a Catholic family. I have a background of medical profession. I have a background of public administration. Presently, I'm also working. I'm a top government official. I'm working, so I know the workings of government. And presently, I'm also a student of law. So when you say all these things, sometimes I'm confused. Where do we go? And because from what the lawyer has said, if you look at what is chapter 2 of the Constitution says, it's basically you are talking about the Catholic doctrine. The Catholic social teaching. But like he said, there is a 419 clause that makes it that it does not work. Where we have all agreed now that yes, we need to review the Constitution. However, I still have a problem. And the problem I have is this. The average citizens of this country, do they actually understand what is the role of government? In other words, what is it that government has to do for you? We talk about the rent-seeking behavior. The rent-seeking behavior is simply because most people don't actually understand what is the government, what is the job of government, what do government should do for us? Because I think that's the starting point. And that is now where I feel the church can do a lot. And I think maybe the panelists, I was thinking probably they will contribute on that. I didn't hear that. On the Catholic social teaching, interestingly, I just read this encyclical. The encyclical is 1967. I was less than 3 years old. I read it and it was like, sorry. So, the church already had a solution to what we are saying since 1967. And I think if you look at our country now, it's a country where we are so religious. Every Sunday, please, if you look at the number of people who come out from churches. So my question is this. My suggestion is this. What is it that the church can do to help, in terms of, and I think the professor actually made that, the professor from Notre Dame, sorry, I forgot her name. She's mentioning about, part of the solution of making the communities realize their rights, their potentials, and their role. Jesus Christ took some 12 guys and they transformed the whole world. I believe that if we, the Christians, understand what is the cost, what is this church teaching, and we understand the role of government, and we also understand what we as individuals we are supposed to do, I believe that probably we can have a way out of this. So I suggest, and I don't know what the role, in terms of elaboration and continual teaching and education of the people to understand their role, their functions, and their rights, and to see how those rights can be enforced. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. I have Father Debusui, the gentleman with the white mask.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Father Tony Adebusui. I'm a parish priest. This background I want to give will help me get help from you. I work at Idanre. Idanre has only one straight road, and the road is not motorable. Everybody, we have about 129,000 people in that local government. 129,000. Majority of us live in the farms. We're in rainy season. Everybody is cut off from everybody. I've listened attentively since Monday to all the presentations and what development to bring to us and what we are supposed to be enjoying, like water resources, like electricity. Our generator burns 24 hours a day. We only see electricity when they want to share bills. Okay. Health education, health services. Well, if you have money and you don't want to die, you better go and look for help to go to hospital. Doctors are on strike, no medication, no this, no that. And I'm here, by the grace of God, hoping to go back to my people, Abi. No road, no means of preserving what is produced. At Idanre, we produce what we don't eat, and we buy everything that we eat. We produce cocoa. We can't eat cocoa. those who grow the cocoa and harvest them, they can't eat it, but they don't have the money, because those who export the cocoa, they get more money than the farmer. So I don't know, put all this together. I don't know who will respond to me. As I'm hoping to go back to Idari tomorrow, what do I take along? Where do we begin from? How do we bring these developments? But anytime they want to do election, all the candidates know how to get to the people in the villages, but after the election, nobody knows road. Thank you.
Before we continue with the questions, I will want the panelists to respond so that they can they wouldn't forget the question. So the first question is about citizens' participation. From the legal perspective, I will wish Professor Desiatu to have the first intervention.
Right.
And I will expect Professor Akinwale to have the second intervention from the perspective of Populorum Progressio, while I will expect Professor Yunusa to have intervention from the perspective of the government. As regards the second question, that is the role of the church. I think I would expect a little bit of commentary from Father Akinwale and Professor Desiatu, who mentioned something as regards to that. The last question, I would reframe that after the answer to the first two questions. Professor Desiatu, please.
Thank you, Father Fidelis, and thank you very much for all the very good points and comments that were raised. Let me clarify first and foremost, when we talk about the right to development, as I said at the outset, it is a development path that is defined by the population themselves. Therefore, it is not for me, much as it is not for any other external party, to impose a vision of development to which Nigeria has a better understanding of what it means for its own development that is consistent with its own identity. The whole point of bringing in the dimension of human rights and subsistence rights in particular is to bring to everyone's attention that the task of realizing our own respective human rights is not simply from the standpoint of the obligations of a government. It also lies with an active citizenry that is vigilant about its own rights, that looks for those expectations, whether at the ballot box when they are voting, or when they act as consumers, or when they try to lobby and influence legislation, or when they act as workers, or when they act as small businesses. We all have roles to play as community members. But if we act in ways that are oblivious to how to make our respective governments accountable within the context and systems in which we inhabit, then we ourselves are also not part of the process of realizing and implementing human rights. Now, the barrister who spoke earlier very rightly pointed out paradoxes within the Constitution. Now, this is a technical legal standpoint, but let me make this as simple as possible. Independent of constitutional obligations, domestic legal obligations, when a state, such as Nigeria, signs a treaty and does not fulfill its obligations under the treaty, it can be internationally responsible for its non-fulfillment of those obligations under a treaty. Never mind that there is countervailing domestic legislation. Responsibility at the international level is different from responsibility at the domestic level, which is why when we look at, for example, cases at the International Court of Justice, the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights in the 2004 Advisory Wall opinion was used as the basis to declare that Israel was in violation of those rights, particularly of Palestinians in occupied territories. There is nothing that precludes courts in the international sphere to evaluate whether or not a treaty has been complied with. But that's a separate discussion altogether. My immediate concern is when we talk about participation and legal participation, to what end? And it's very rightly pointed out by our colleague who asked, but I'm confused, what can be done? Quite rightly, it's not for me or for any other speaker to prescribe how that development should continue. The fact is, if we have not been having this discussion as a community, if we have not been galvanizing as communities to determine the education that is desired, the health system that is desired, how to go about it from point A to point B, if everything is delegated to a government and that government is in no sense responsible or accountable to the voters, then there is a clear deficit. There is a clear democratic deficit that has to be addressed, whether that's done in a constitutional setting or whether that's done at the ballot box through voting, through the many levers through which change can happen within the society as you know it. But it also can't happen in a vacuum of expectation, thinking that the right to development as an obligation of the state will automatically just be realized by the state. No, it is a right that is held by individuals, groups, and populations to author your own development, to be yourself the active agents and subjects of our own development. And howsoever that development is defined, if the vision of that development is not participatory, but rather dictated and concentrated in the hands of a few, such as those who are elites that hold the reins of power in government or in other sectors, then there is a clear issue that has to be discussed throughout the population. Rather than think of it as being passive recipients of rights, to have human rights also entails having the awareness and the solidarity, as was described earlier by Professor Akinwale, the necessary solidarity and cooperation to realize those rights. Now, whether those rights will be realized through judicial action, such as a court order, or through the standard workings and processes of government that has to respond to constituents, this has to respond to citizens, that is part and parcel of the process of human rights implementation. It may sound very pedestrian, but the granular work of monitoring our leaders and making sure that they do what they are supposed to do, that is part and parcel of the task of human rights work. And that is exactly at the heart of the right to development when we talk about the legal right to participate. I'll leave it at that and turn over to my other colleagues.
Thank you, Professor. Father Akinwale, please.
Thank you. I keep my focus on the encyclical Populorum Progressio. The title speaks for itself, Development of People. It is the people who are agents of development. And I think Professor, a colleague from the US, sorry, I can't get the name rightly here, she has emphasized that very well. For so long, we have acted as if government were agents of development. The role of government is not to develop the land. That is the responsibility of the people. The role of government is to secure the land, secure the people as they work towards the development of the land. Unfortunately, what we have is a constitution that has instituted a government that disables the people. The role of leadership is to enable the people, but unfortunately, in Nigeria and in much of Africa, leadership disables the led. And when leadership disables the led, it becomes impossible for development to take place. Now is the time to ask ourselves or to address three foundational questions. One, what should be the relationship between the government and the citizen? That is crucial. Two, if we say we're running a federal constitution, what should be the relationship between the three tiers of government, federal, state, local, and what should be the relationship amongst the various institutions of government? And three, what should be the relationship between a citizen and a fellow citizen? That third question, by the way, is crucial to addressing the ongoing escalation of conflict between herdsmen and farmers in this country. What happens if you violate my right? What happens if I violate your right? As we are right now, the people are disabled. And because the people are disabled, the people cannot develop. We cannot have development of peoples as envisaged by Pope Paul VI in that famous encyclical Populorum Progressio. We are, in a way, we are like George Floyd. You remember his famous words? I can't breathe. Government stifles the citizen cannot breathe. We have to shake off government in this country. Now, I'm not advocating anarchy, but I'm advocating a situation where the terms of engagement between the state and the citizen are rightly defined. Without that, we're going nowhere.
Thank you so much, Father. I want Professor Unisa to do two things. There's a couple of things that was mentioned by one of the interventionists. So in your response, Professor Unisa, I would want you to respond to the whole idea of rent economy. Monsignor Koledwe, in one sentence, can you let others know the meaning of rent economy in just one sentence? What does that mean, rent economy? And Professor Unisa, in response to the first question, you will respond to the reality of rent economy in Nigeria just within few minutes so that we can have other questions. Rent economy, Monsignor.
Thank you very much. Rent economy is basically an economy that is based on extractive industry, based particularly in the context of Nigeria oil economy, where we have 90% of our resources from oil. So that is a rent economy. And I think what Father Akinwale is saying is very, very important, because one of the characteristics of rent economy is this rent mentality, renter behavior. So it's not just about the institutional framework that we talk about here. Rather, we're also talking about the normative aspect of development, the political networks, the relationship between the policymakers and the people, the relationship between the politicians and the people, and the interactions also amongst ourselves. So it's all about the civic culture. That is, I believe, what Father Akinwale is also talking about. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Monsignor. Professor Unisa, you have the ground to respond to the old question of citizens' participation as a government official, as a policymaker, and to respond to the whole idea of rent economy within the Nigerian system for a couple of minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Father. I think fundamentally the definition given by the last speaker, that's the legal definition of rentier state. A rentier state is one who takes revenue or takes money or resources from a source that he has not invested, or he has invested little or nothing. That's the implication of a rentier state from the economic perspective. When you do not invest anything and you take money from it, what it means that that particular source of revenue is not sustainable. Whether you like it or not, it will collapse one day. And that is the fundamental point that we need to understand. We could have a rentier government and we could have rentier citizens. The mentality of our people also need to, change in respect of, I listen to most of the people that have been speaking, and it's about what government will do for us, what government will do for us. But Father Akinwale mentioned it very clearly. People are the authentic and sustainable source of development. When people cannot contribute value, because at the center of everything we are talking about is value creation. If value is not created and we are unable to generate excess value, that is to say, what you take from the system must be lower than, what you take from the system must be lower than what you contribute. What you contribute must be larger than what you take from the system. If you take more than what you contribute to the system, that system is not sustainable. It will collapse. And so once we realize that, we understand the fact that the system that we have had is a rentier state because there is no specific value proposition that is driving the economic growth that we have been witnessing over the years. We are taking money from oil. What is the value that our own people here creating from money, aside from, the foreigners that are bringing the technology, bringing their own capital, bringing everything, and government just collect money from where. And that is why people are saying even the technological advancement that is taking place in other parts of the world is a good thing for us, that even this oil will no longer be useful. Let us go back to old days. In the Western region, when we were producing cocoa and all the likes, the Western region was able to do a lot. The first television station in Africa was set up in the Western region with cocoa money, not with oil money. The first, just like Nigeria has, the Nigeria then has, an agency, a high commission in the UK. The Western region has one also at that particular time. So we must look at value creation as being the basic thing that must be at the center of everything. It is not about people just taking money. Now, for me, economic and political, if you look at development, economic development is both political and economic. If we look at it from that perspective, and we will now understand that in the process of achieving economic development, we need very, very literate and committed people, disciplined leaders that are going to drive that process. If we do not have very literate and committed leaders, we are making noise. We are not making anything. And the fundamental question that I want to raise, which is here, is the fact that what is the recruitment process for leaders? That is what we have been getting wrong. The recruitment process, which is the job of political parties, is the fundamental problem of our problem. The people that are literate, that has what it takes to lead most of the time, don't get ticket to contest the election. It's a problem. Irrespective of the relationship that's going to exist between the various arms of government and even institutions within the system, you need a very clear-headed leader who understands development and is committed to driving his people to achieve that development. I believe that right-based approach to development is very good. But the fundamental question is this: at what level are you demanding, are you advocating right-based development? If the fundamental state of the economy at a point in time is such that the economic system is weak, and you put right-based approach to it, what you have is a situation whereby individuals within that particular system will come up and just be singing, this is what we're supposed to get from government. They will not be thinking about what they can create and contribute to the growth of that economy. And that is fundamental. So for me, I want to advocate that, look, development is both economic and political, and the political process that produces leaders is very, very key. People that are in strategic positions that are going to lead development and ensure that we get out of these woods, what is the process of recruiting them? That process is faulty. And we are saying that until we have a process that is transparent, that we produce people who has what it takes to lead and in positions, we will just be talking grammar, and that grammar will not lead us to anywhere. Political recruitment process. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you so much. I have so many hands on, and while I will yield the ground to some of the questions, Professor Akinwale, in answer one of the questions, please take a little bit of time to explain what common good is all about. Professor Yunusa mentioned the reciprocity between giving and taking from the structure. How does that play into the whole idea of the common good? And also, Professor Desiato, can we just stop the movement a little bit, please? Ushers, can you stop the movement a little bit, please? Let's finish this. Thank you. And Professor Desiato, there is a concern expressed by Professor Yunusa about the right-based approach to poverty. In your experience, how does right-based approach to poverty create a problematic structure for the government, or it is not the case that right-based approach to poverty does that? So I will now take the questions before I yield the grounds to the professors. The gentleman there has been raising his hand, and I will also welcome our Royal Highness, Princess Falowo Munyolua, the regent of Ibuleshoro. She also has a question. So after the young man, then we'll turn the microphone to the regent. Please, let's make use of the time, please.
My name is Ojo Paul. Now, I will try to raise some points here and as well like to have clarification on it. Now, the first thing I would like us to understand is that we are talking about Nigeria, which is a peculiar country with a peculiar issue. And I'd like us to first of all contextualize our issue in this nation in terms of an advocate of what we call African psychology. One of the things that we always fail to understand.
And the speaker used the microphone. We're not hearing properly.
Can you hear me now?
Please, can you just frame your question within 40 seconds so that we can?
All right. My question goes thus. The panelists have been saying that the people. Now, we are the people. Elementary definition of democracy says is the government for the people and of the people. Now, the truth there is the fact that after this summit, what is next? How do we hold our government accountable? The last constitutional amendment that was heard by the National Assembly, we all knew what happened there. Now, we keep saying we need to hold them accountable. But what are the process? Now, Father Akinwale said something earlier, talking about something that is, but Father has to put a pause to it, that sounds like a revolution. But rather say, what we need is a mental revolution. Now, in the fact that we need to go back to the roots, our foundation is faulty. Father Fidelis Olukumboro said something yesterday, which has to do with the fact that we need to reorient. There needs to be orientation of the younger ones to know the values and what is obtainable. The chapter 4 of Nigerian Constitution talks about fundamental human rights. Now, the truth is, how many of us even knows that? Now, if not for this summit, I don't know anything about the social teaching of the Catholic Church. Now, I've been able to get myself abreast of it since 1967, like Dr. has said. Our problem, solution has been found then. But the truth is, our leaders have owed us. It's a jubilee, in which, in the real sense of it, what we call economic slavery. We had our election the last time. We buy people's conscience, and because master hierarchy of this talks about the basic needs of every human being is not even provided. So you can't expect a drastic change if those needs are not met. Everybody will. You cannot take your 4 years when you don't have a food on your table. You only think of now.
Right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I will take the regent's question or comment before I will take one more, then return to the panelists. We're seriously out of time. Okay. Can you have the microphone to the regent, please? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate all the panelists, and I really gained a lot from their contribution to this topic. But sometimes I get, shall I say, nervous with this kind of programs, because at the end of the day, just like the father from Idoris said, we just go back home with things remaining the same. The only thing that we have is now improved knowledge. Okay, I've learned some things, but these do not automatically manifest into the change we desire to see, especially by people that are really concerned, people that are capable of making this change. I mean, the main policy makers, the people that are really turning the progress of this country, the people that are turning it upside down, the people that are probably in one hotel resting, relaxing, while the rest of us talk and we go back to our houses. So as a community leader, I try my best in my little capacity that in what way can I improve the economy of my people? Because when we talk about economy among local communities, we are talking about the price of Titus fish. We are talking about how much the buying power of the salaries people collect. We are talking about whether people can afford to buy the number of cement required to build their houses. We may not know these big terminologies, but when we talk about human development, what comes to the average mind of anyone out there is, how has my life even gotten better within the past few years? The life of my wife, the life of my children. So these problems that we are talking about, they are so overwhelming. Like I said earlier, as a community leader, I try my best, but either way, it still goes back to the foundation, because there are ways I am limited, even as a community leader, to improve the lives of my people, but I'm still limited because of some of the bad laws we have. There are sometimes I have issues maybe with the government, or with maybe I'm trying to do something innovative, and the government will just come and say, oh, we will start collecting money on this. I'm like, this is for the good of the people, and you want to start taxing us? So before you know it, I get weary. I'm like, okay, let's leave things to the government to do. So we try as local communities to try, but either way, it still boils down to the Constitution. It still boils down to the fact that we have a systemic issue. No matter how good you are, no matter how brilliant you are, no matter how capable you are, in a bad system, you still end up getting frustrated. So I want to implore this meeting and the organizers of this event, that maybe because I'm frustrated right now, I'm confused, but I don't know if there is a way we could have, I don't know, just like I've been hearing about Catholic social teachings. I don't know them, I'm not a Catholic, but if there are ways that we can revolutionize things, that, see, we are talking about economy, see insecurity. Who wants to make money where you are afraid to travel, where you are whether the money you are even making is going to be used as ransom eventually. So people are scared, people are afraid. We have systemic issue, we have leadership issue. I'm so frustrated.
All right, Your Highness. Thank you. Yeah, I want to crave the indulgence of the panelists and everybody that we're supposed to end this session by, 2 minutes ago. So I want to crave the indulgence. If you can use the next 10 minutes for the 2 more questions and the contribution of the panelists. I will not be able to go round. I will have Barrister Hilary, please frame the question within 40 seconds, and I will stop you 40 seconds.
Just quickly to point our minds to the provision of the United Nations Declaration of Right to Development. It says that recognizing that the creation of conditions favorable to the development of peoples and individuals is the primary responsibility of their states. Section 14 of the Constitution is the fulcrum of what is called the concept of popular sovereignty. It says that sovereignty belongs to the people. That's section 14 of the Constitution. Section 6 of the Constitution says you cannot enforce that provision. I want to also, Dr. Desiato, respectfully, Nigerians cannot access international courts. Nigerians cannot, the only international court Nigerians can access as individuals is the ECOWAS Court of Justice. And decisions of the ECOWAS Court of Justice have not been implemented. The Nigerians have access, the African Charter intends that Nigerians should be able to access, for instance, the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, but it's fraught with technicalities. Nigerians should be able to approach the African Court of Justice. It is fraught with technicalities because Nigeria has not done what is required to allow access of its citizens to those international organizations. And of course, only states can come before the ICJ, International Court of Justice, except international organizations who may invoke the advisory jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice. So I come back to Father Akinwale's statement: Nigerians can't breathe.
Father Fidelis, we cannot hear you on the Zoom.
Okay, John Bosco, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. My question is directed to Barrister Hillary. And in 2014, there is a national confab, which I'm sure we know the outcomes of that committee was not used. And recently, in May 2 this year, there is this public hearing concerning 1999 Constitution Amendment. And in case this year's own recommendations and solution is not used to, is there a section in the Constitution whereby individual can hold the government responsible in order to be accountable for what they are doing? Thank you.
I will permit a response to that if we have the time, but let me yield the ground to the panelists, please. You may start, Father Akinwale.
Okay, common good. I would say common good is attained when I work for my good by working for our good, and when I work for our good by working for my good. Common good is the actualization of personal potential in the actualization of our collective potential. After all said and done, a developed polity is a cohabitation of persons of actualized potential. So unless we're able to attain our personal potential, actualize our personal potential within our collective potential, there's nothing like the attainment of common good. And when I say that government is too powerful in this country, I am not just talking of the federal government. I am talking of government at federal, state, and local levels. We have the privilege of having with us a state commissioner here. I think it is a point to be taken home to our governors and to our local government chairmen and women. Government in Nigeria is too powerful. Government in Nigeria is arrogant. Government in Nigeria disables the people. The recipe for underdevelopment is complete.
Thank you so much, Father. Professor Desiato, please.
Let me respond to Professor Inusa's concerns about rights-based development, but also most importantly, speak to the members of the participants in this forum who has expressed their frustration. There are many shared frustrations about what to do. Professor Inusa looks at the rights-based approach as possibly prohibitive to development because it might foment a dependence on entitlements, on demands, rather than value creation. I beg to differ. You cannot have a reliable political recruitment process that has independence, impartiality, and all the attributes of fairness if in the first instance there is no social mobility when it comes to opportunities, when concentration of education, wealth, access, and power is in the hands of a few, and the basic food on the table is not met. You can't realistically produce leaders from the grassroots. There will always be an unequal divide that will keep widening as more of Nigeria's haves dominate positions of power vis-a-vis those who have not. So I take a firm view. The rights-based approach to development is intended, especially from the schools of thought of Amartya Sen and so many others, to empower capabilities at the grassroots level so that also the political process is appropriately informed, instead of excluding others, because we enable the civil, political, economic, social, cultural rights of those who participate in the political process. There are more chances for mobility. There are more chances for a genuine recruitment that's not just focused on trying to put food on the table every day. At least that's speaking from my experience in the Philippines as well, where we are very much burdened with many of the same challenges that Nigeria has. Let me go to the comments of our colleague, of our barrister colleague, and I appreciate that you know Nigerian law, and you do know your system much better, and there is a problem about enforceability. That is very much the lawyer's approach, but rather controversially, my approach is not that of a lawyer in and of itself. Lawsuits do not create the path to development. We can fight the court battles now and say that for this particular court decision, the government was wrong. For this particular court decision, the government was wrong. But the judiciary does not create law. The judiciary interprets and applies law on a case-to-case basis. And if the way and the path to which a people attempts to try and chart their own path to development is by filing lawsuits, that is not only a very much a lost promise of the judiciary, but also it raises expectations about what the judiciary can or cannot do. One thing that we haven't talked about here is what the community, especially speaking to the community leader who spoke about so poignantly about her frustration. Communities can do so much in sustained power as coalitions of voters, as social movements that can influence and lobby policy at the governmental regulatory level. Also, those sustained movements who can also influence the legislature to themselves create the mechanisms for accountability. In the Philippines, that translated to creating an office of the ombudsman, a constitutional officer that was able to get rid of presidents all the way from local government officials to presidents for graft and corruption. But that was the path that was chosen in the Philippines, and it was a popular lobby that created that. It was a grassroots coalition that created that. It's not for me to tell Nigerians what you want to do, and I share your sentiment. But this is the beginning of the discussion of what should be done. And we can't have this discussion about what development means for Nigeria and what should be done if we don't first confront the fundamental reality that there are rights, and the transformation of those moral rights, those subsistence rights, those legal, moral subsistence and legal rights into a functional reality for every Nigerian is the part and parcel of the dialogue, the sustained dialogue that we have to have. Dialogue is painful because it's easy to think, let's have a quick solution, let's go to court, a judge will order something. Trust me, anybody who's tried to enforce a judgment, it takes long, even to try and enforce judgments. Courts don't magically wield wands and say things will change just like that. It takes vigilance on the part of communities to enforce court judgments, to implement laws, to enforce political processes, to ensure that democratic guarantees are met. I mean, those frustrations I share very much because I pretty much see myself in the same boat. I would come out of the same process and think to myself, why are things always the same? And then I realized we can't sue our way to development. I need more people to sustain the effort. It has to be a generation, the work of generations, the work of a people for generations to build their own path. There are examples. Norway, for example, built its own oil fund that's accountable to its entire people. How every expenditure and every disbursement from the oil revenues of Norway, it's one of the most famous sovereign wealth funds. It's a model in many respects because that's complete transparency and complete accountability to the dollar. of how much and where the money is spent. Those are fundamental questions. Where is budgeting going in Nigeria? The same questions that you ask about how do things work and not work? Why were there all these failures? We can't just rely on concentrating that knowledge in the hands of a few, in the hands of the few who are lucky enough, fortunate enough, and blessed enough to make it through the political process and become possibly Director General of the World Trade Organization, who was Nigeria's former finance minister. Not everybody is going to be born like that. When you have 105 million people living the daily reality of deprivation, of poverty, and all the social goods that come with it, we can't wait for a political recruitment process to try and resolve that. Everybody has to get involved. I share the sentiments. I would be glad to talk with a barrister colleague because there are other fora outside of the International Court of Justice to try and seek judicially adjudicated accountability piece by piece on a policy basis. Nigeria is a party to the ICCPR. It can also be brought before the Human Rights Committee. It's also a party to the covenant, so many of the human rights treaties that has never been tested before. But that's a separate conversation on technicalities. I just wanted to focus on that. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much. Right now, I'm going to have the panelists to give their final comments for 1 minute. While they think of that, I would expect Father Akinwale to briefly touch on the question that has been raised by one of those who raised the question, Dr. Holiday, I guess, who mentioned the functions of the parish. How does the church operate in this kind of system? Why you make a final comment? And also, Professor Desiato, is there a way you can articulate also briefly in your final comment? Is there a particular plan within the Philippines of how the church organized like civic education through the parish system, something like that, just in few words? And also, I would also expect Professor Unicef to, in his final comment, to just briefly mention if it's concerned about the right-based approach has been through some concern that he has seen in the past, or if there are evidence, so to speak, that when you operate the right-based approach to poverty, it engenders dependence on the government and disregard development. While you think of these questions, I have the authority from Father Valentine, who represents the bishop, that I should, before handing over the microphone, take the question of one of I'll be in trouble if I don't do that. So, madam, for 1 minute, please, while the panelists prepare their final comments, raise your question or your comment.
Good afternoon, everybody. Olopade. I've listened to so many suggestions, good and beautiful ideas that can give us better development. But people matters. Constitution has failed us in this country. For 6 years, I've fought the fight against corruption. Has not yielded anything. I want us to now start to fight against our attitude from all levels: federal, state, local government, street, town, homes. Because bad children will become bad leaders. We try to target our attitude, because all we have been investing on this country and be failing, or because our foundation is not strong enough. I want us to emphasize the energy we are putting on corruption now, to now shift to attitude. Because if you have good attitude, believe me or not, they are going to have reduction in corruption. induction in bad leadership, induction in the bandits, or those things. This is just my suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ma. While you make your final comments, panelists, please attend to the concern of Our Royal Highness and also Baladebusi from Idonre. What is one thing that may change the situation that were left before we came in? May. I yield to Professor Yunusa, please.
Thank you so much. My colleague from, Dane, Professor, I want to say that you interpreted me wrongly in that I didn't say that right-based approach is completely bad. I said it depends on the economic development that the country has reached before you begin to talk about right-based approach. If you do not have growth, you do not have people creating value in the system, right-based approach will create a kind of this other problem of dependency that we talked about. But I'm happy you said something very important, and that is development is a process. Development is a process, and that's why you spoke about generations and generations. If I talk about a generation is not a about why for the had that consistent follow-up to develop the habit of doing things good. And that is what we need for us to be able to do all those. Once we are able to get all these in place, then right-based approach, which talks about the distribution of the resources that is already on ground, then we'll be able to get it. One major problem again, which we have not considered in Nigeria, is the structure of our state creation. The state creation, multiplicity of states and all the likes. Fundamentally, each of those states that are created build a very huge bureaucracy that still depends on the oil revenue that we are talking about. Essentially, what happens now is that the money that is generated from oil, which ordinarily should be used to prosecute quite a lot of developmental projects, are used in paying salaries and salaries and salaries. At the end of the day, what is left for development is very, 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 very marginal. And of course, we have spoken about the constitutional provision that gives 52.8% of the national resources to federal government that has no human being, that has no citizen of his own, aside from citizens that belong to the state level and local government level. Why is it that local governments are not empowered to be able to have resources to implement projects? And programs, sex reports, and Ministry of federal government has no business in Ministry of Water Resources. They have no water anywhere, no water body anywhere for them to provide water to the people. This is what we are saying. So people that has the mandate to do all these things, let's do decentralization of functions, devolution of power to the subnational level, and at that level, we'll discover that we'll be able to get things done better. You have said it very clearly and very, very correctly too. If you go to international courts, and judgment is delivered on Nigeria, will a foreign country come and feed us in Nigeria or come and provide anything for us? Absolutely no. And you have said it, even if there's any sanction that will follow the judgment, it will take time before those things will be enforced. So for me, I would think that we should pay more attention to, how we get, the right set of people in positions. And from there, we'll be able to take it off from there. Most of the elections, when people move around, these people that you say they are not good, they are not good. What you need to do, if you don't like them, don't vote for them, and they will not be in positions. But when they come to your community, they give you bribe, you collect, you are part of the looting, you are part of the corruption, you are also corrupt. And that is what we must, stop. So there is need for us to educate, get our people educated to be able to understand all this. And if you don't understand all this and people just say, okay, let's just be speaking grammar, Grammar will not take us anywhere. Thank you, Father.
Thank you so much, Professor. Yeah, Professor Desiato, you have your time now for your final comment.
Thank you very much for all of the observations. It reminds me of an expression. We can walk and chew gum at the same time. The challenge here is that Nigeria already does have the resources. It does have oil revenues. It does have the wealth. The question is also where the wealth is distributed. The point that has been made is that you wait for value creation to reach a sufficient threshold before we start with distributive questions. Where Professor Yunusa and I have differences is that in my own work in the UN, witnessing the Nigerian representative make his representations at the United Nations, they do believe, at least in their representations to the United Nations, that value creation takes place simultaneously with distributional decisions. The sequencing, the so-called logic of sequencing that so many countries have adopted for so long becomes another excuse for repression, for tactics that say it's a state of emergency, therefore let's just wait until we sufficiently build up the national wealth before we start thinking about how we distribute and allocate it. That's why I say we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can try and grow revenue and create wealth and try to make the distributional decisions that are accountable and responsible under a legal framework on rights. But let me go to Father Fidelis's question. And particularly in the experience of the Philippines, what was so material was the church as a development partner was not focused on a specific vision of development. It became the gathering space for local communities, not just to articulate their concerns, but to also start understanding themselves in the process. The church was a conduit between government, between the private sector, but at the same time, first and foremost, they advocate for the communities themselves, first and foremost. What was formative for the change in our culture, especially for the sustained movement that created the Anti-Graft and Corrupt Practices Act, that has since resulted in a different culture, was the kind of education that the Office of the Ombudsman was able to implement in tandem with the church. And when I asked my father, who used to be one of the ombudsmen who served the country, what was the most important thing that he did? Was it jailing the presidents? And he jailed several for corruption, all the way from generals to cabinet secretaries to legislators. And he himself there were several assassination attempts against him in the process. He told me no, and he's now close to 90 years old. And he told me what was most important was the educational component that he partnered on with the church, because there has to be a mentality, not just of intolerance for the immorality of corruption, but also to get beyond the notion of indifference, the feeling of futility, that there's nothing we can do, that they're too powerful, they're too rich, that we can't report because nothing will be done. He created an anonymous complaints mechanism that empowered so many citizens individually to file the complaints through their churches without it being attributed to the citizens, and thus the fear of retaliation would not occur, but rather investigation would occur. But that's the particular accountability mechanism that was conceptualized together by communities and not top down. It was together by communities who had a sustained grassroots awareness of their own rights, of their own human rights. In one way, it was their way of enforcing their rights by creating a legislated mechanism to enable better transparency and accountability. It's not a perfect system, but it spelled the difference for the change in culture. And this is really what's at stake here. When we're talking about trying to chart a path to development under the right to development, it can't happen externally or extrinsically without an understanding of the people themselves. For me, the parish communities are crucial. They are critical because they know their communities through and through. They engage in dialogue with their communities, and they are a safe space for this dialogue, for the sustained democratic dialogue to take place. And I can only hope that the beginnings of this will happen here with this summit, and hopefully with the Catholic diocese taking it upon itself to engage in active citizenry in defining their own development. Thank you for all the observations and for the opportunity to exchange views.
Professor Desato will be here tomorrow. I hope you can also repeat the final comments when the bishops are here tomorrow. But the bishop's representative will take your final message to the bishop. Now, Father Akinwale, it's your turn, please.
Thank you very much. Let me begin by saying it's been my pleasure having Professor Yunusa and Professor Desierto as co-panelists. We've had very stimulating discussions. We are in this situation because we have an abysmally low respect for human rights. If we don't respect human rights, we don't respect human dignity, which is a very important component of Catholic social doctrine. When Professor Yunusa was talking of devolution of powers, well, we've heard that so many times. My concern is quite often officials of state governments, what they mean by devolution of powers is devolution of powers from the federal to the state government. I think we need something more than that. It's not just devolution of powers from federal to state or local. It's devolution of powers to the people. Power belongs to the people. That's why there's that problem with Section 2 of the Nigerian Constitution that makes sovereignty reside in the state, not in the people. That's why the state is too powerful. That's why the state makes it impossible for us to breathe. Sure, we need strong institutions, but institutions that serve the people, not institutions that disable the people. On a final note, if you want to destroy a society, you don't need to send in an army. Destroy education. If you want to rebuild a society, restore education. All this points to education in Nigeria. We need to educate ourselves on why we are in this situation. That points to history, which is not very much studied in Nigeria today. History of Nigeria, history of this constitution, history of constitutionalism in Nigeria. It is quite revealing. It is quite revealing. I would ask members of the audience to read Richard Bond's book, Nigeria, A Turbulent Century. How do we get out of this? This is where education in Catholic social doctrine comes in. It has to be done at parochial, diocesan, and national level. And I want to throw a challenge at my brother priests. Every Sunday when you get up to preach, you have a captive audience of not less than 1,000. Pass the message on. I was kind of taken aback when somebody said from the audience that he was hearing of Populorum Progressio for the first time. It's not just Populorum Progressio. We're talking of a tradition of Catholic social teaching that goes all the way back to Rerum Novarum of Leo XIII in 1845. But I have good news. I have good news for us, and that is the Catholic Bishops' Conference of Nigeria has now decided that Catholic social doctrine would be taught at primary, secondary, and tertiary level. I've been asked to work with a team to draw up the curriculum for the study of Catholic social doctrine at these levels. It is not something that is tied to the Bible. In other words, you don't even need to subscribe to our Christian faith before you subscribe to Catholic social teaching, because it is based on our common denominator. And that common denominator is not our faith. That common denominator is human reason. It's a powerful tool for development. We need to deploy it by making sure that we get things right in the area of education. And I think that is what this panel discussion has largely contributed to. Thank you very much for organizing it, and thank you for inviting me to be part of it.
Thank you so much. We are 30 minutes after the scheduled time, which is Okay. So before I hand over the microphone to the bishop's representative and this Ether, I will say the final, the comments and close for the day. I just want to make a couple of announcements briefly. Tomorrow, we delve deeply rather into the conversation, and tomorrow we'll be having another 4 panelists, and I'll be co-moderating with Professor Desiato, who would likely raise further questions. So tomorrow we'll be having Peter Casarella from Duke University, Professor Joe Kaboski from the University of Notre Dame, Professor Patu Tomi from Center for Leadership and Values, and also the former presidential and governorship aspirant. And we'll also have another policymaker on the panel tomorrow, Mr. Ben Akabweze. And hopefully also we'll have some traditional leaders to engage with, and also hopefully the governor of Ondo State. So we have a lot of engagement tomorrow, and we hope that all of you will be here and more people will be here. So Father Valentine, I will hand over the microphone, and Desata, you will take it up. I mean, Ether, Asiala rather, you will take it up after Father Valentine. Thank you.
I will do exactly what the bishop has asked me to do, and that is to thank all of you for attending this summit today. I am not in a position to give his comments because he himself will be physically, God willing, he will be here tomorrow to give his own comments. I have listened very carefully. I've enjoyed myself to all the discussions of today, and I don't know tomorrow, but I do know him who holds tomorrow in his hands. I know that tomorrow Nigeria will be good. I am convinced that all the theories and all the discussions and all our concerns today, as a nation who believe in God, we cannot specify and we do not know. We can only try our best. But as a Nigerian who live in the diaspora, as someone who understands other people's culture and see what they do and how they do it, I have never lost hope in my country, and I have never lost hope in my land. And I believe Nigeria is destined by God Almighty to be on a very, very, very golden spot in the world. And it shall happen by the grace of God. That is my own comment. The bishop will tell you more tomorrow. You are all invited. Thanks to all our panelists. Thanks to Father Fidelis, the organizer. And we are wishing you all God's blessing. And may God continue to bless you. And may God continue to bless Nigeria.
All right, Ether, you may have the floor and conclude. Welcome to Nigeria.
Well, I think Father Valentine said it better than I could. We are delighted to have so many of you in person in the audience and joining us on Zoom. As Father Fidelis said, we will have a similar session tomorrow with different panelists, so we hope you can join us. And the Zoom link remains the same tomorrow. So for those joining us virtually, please log on. And we will have the recordings of all of these sessions made available to you on YouTube. And we will have those sent out at the conclusion of tomorrow's session. So again, thank you for joining us, and we will see you tomorrow.